Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am going to read to you another Beverly Cleary book, and this one is called Ramona and Her Mother. And I think I'm going to like this book because I happen to be a mother, and I happen to have two very wonderful mothers in my life. My own mother is just about my very best friend. She can talk to me about anything, and I can talk to her about anything. And my mother-in-law, I go see her every morning and drink coffee with her and just have a good time with her. And she is also one of my very best friends. And so I hope that you feel about your mother the same way that I feel about my mothers. And let's see how Ramona feels about her mother. I'm sure she has a wonderful mother. Mothers are a special gift from God. Chapter 1, A Present for Willa Jean. When will they be here? Asked Ramona Quimby, who was supposed to be dusting the living room, but instead was twirling around trying to make herself dizzy. She was much too excited to dust. In half an hour, cried her mother from the kitchen, where she and Ramona's big sister Beatrice were opening and closing the refrigerator and oven doors, bumping into one another, forgetting where they had laid the pot holders, finding them, and then losing the measuring spoons. The Quimbys were about to entertain their neighbors at a New Year's Day brunch to celebrate Mr. Quimby's finding a job at the ShopRite market after being out of work for several months. Ramona liked the word brunch, half breakfast and half lunch, and secretly felt the family had cheated because they had eaten their real breakfast earlier. They needed their strength to get ready for the party. And Ramona, said Mrs. Quimby, as she hastily laid out silverware on the dining room table, be nice to Willa Jean, will you? Try to keep her out of everyone's hair. Ramona, watch that you're doing, said Mr. Quimby, who was laying a fire in the fireplace. You almost knocked over the lamp. Ramona stopped twirling, staggered from the dizziness, and made a face. Willa Jean, the messy little sister of her friend Howie Kemp, was sticky, crumby into everything and always had to have her own way. And behave yourself, said Mr. Quimby. Willa Jean is company. Not my company, thought Ramona, who saw quite enough of Willa Jean when she played at the Howie's house. If Howie can't come to brunch because he has a cold, why can't Willa Jean stay home with their grandmother too? Ramona asked. I really don't know, said Ramona's mother. That isn't the way things worked out. When the Kemps asked if they could bring Willa Jean, I could hardly say no. I could, thought Ramona, deciding that since Willa Jean, welcome or not, was coming to brunch, she had better prepare to defend her possessions. She went to her room, where she swept her best crayons and drawing paper into a drawer and covered them with her pajamas. Her Christmas roller skates and favorite toys, battered stuffed animals that she rarely played with but still loved, went into the corner of her closet. There she hid them under her bathrobe and shut the door tight. But what could she find to amuse Willa Jean? If Willa Jean did not have something to play with, she would be tattling to the grown-ups. Ramona hid her toys. Ramona led a stuffed snake on her bed, then doubted if even Willa Jean would love a stuffed snake. What Ramona needed was a present for Willa Jean, a present wrapped and tied with a good hard knot, a present that would take a long time to unwrap. Next to receiving presents, Ramona liked to give presents, and if she gave Willa Jean a present today, she would not only have the fun of giving, but of knowing the grown-ups would think, isn't Ramona kind? Isn't she generous to give Willa Jean a present? And so soon after Christmas, too, they would look at Ramona in her new red and green plaid slacks and red turtleneck sweater and say, Ramona is one of Santa's helpers, a regular little Christmas elf. Ramona smiled at herself in the mirror and was pleased. 2 of her most important teeth were only half in, which made her look like a jack-o'-lantern, but she did not mind. If she had grown-up teeth, the rest of her face would catch up someday. Over her shoulder, she saw reflected in the mirror a half-empty box of Kleenex on the floor beside her bed. Kleenex! That was the answer to a present for Willa Jean. She ran into the kitchen where Beezus was beating muffin batter while her father fried sausages and her mother struggled to unmold a large gelatin salad onto a plate covered with lettuce. A present is a good idea, agreed Mrs. Quimby when Ramona asked permission, but a box of Kleenex doesn't seem like much of a present. She shook the mold. The salad refused to slide out. Her face was flushed, and she glanced at the clock of the kitchen on the stove. Ramona was insistent. Willa Jean would like it. I know she would. There was no time for explaining what Willa Jean was to do with the Kleenex. Mrs. Quimby was having her problems with the stubborn salad. All right, she consented. There's an extra box in the bathroom cupboard. The salad slid slowly from the mold and rested, green and shimmering, on the lettuce. By the time Ramona had wrapped a large box of Kleenex in leftover Christmas paper, the guests had begun to arrive. First came the Huggins, the McCarthys, and little Miss Swink in a bright green pantsuit. Umbrellas were leaned outside the front door, coats taken into the bedroom, and the usual grown-up remarks exchanged. Happy New Year! Good to see you. We thought we would have to swim over. It's raining so hard. Do you think this rain will ever stop? Who says it's raining? This is good old Oregon sunshine. Ramona felt that she had heard that joke 1,000,000 times, and she was only in the 2nd grade. Then Mr. Huggins said to Ramona's father, Congratulations! I hear you have a new job. That's right, said Mr. Quimby. Starts tomorrow. Great, said Mr. Huggins, and Ramona silently agreed. Having a father without a job had been hard on the whole family. Then Mrs. Swink smiled at Ramona and said, My, Juanita, you're getting to be a big girl. Look, how old are you? I can't keep track. Should Ramona tell Mrs. Swink her name was not Juanita? No, Mrs. Swink was very old and should be treated with courtesy. Last year, Ramona would have spoken up and said, My name is not Juanita, it's Ramona. But not this year. The room fell silent as Ramona answered, I'm 7½ right now. She was proud of herself for speaking so politely. There was soft laughter from the grown-ups, which embarrassed Ramona. Why did they have to laugh? She was 7½ right now. She would not be 7½ forever. Then the Grumbies arrived, followed by Howie's mother and father and the Kemps and, of course, Willa Jean. Although Willa Jean was perfectly capable of walking, her father was carrying her so that she would not get the little white shoes and socks wet. Willa Jean, in turn, was carrying a big stuffed bear. When Mr. Kemp set his daughter down, her mother peeled off her coat, one arm at a time, so Willa Jean would not have to let go of her bear. There stood usually messy Willa Jean in a pink dress with tiny flowers embroidered on the collar. Her curly blonde hair, freshly washed, stood out like a halo. Her blue eyes were the color of a plastic handle on Ramona's toothbrush. When she smiled, she showed her pearly little baby teeth. Willa Jean was not messy at all. Ramona, in her corduroy slacks and turtleneck sweater, suddenly felt big and awkward beside her little guest and embarrassed to have jack-o'-lantern teeth. And the things those grown-ups said to Willa Jean. Well, hello there, sweetheart. Why don't you look like a little angel? Bless your little heart. Did Santa bring you the great big bear? Willa Jean smiled and hugged her bear. Ramona noticed that she had lace ruffles sewn to the seat of her underpants. What is your bear's name, dear? Asked Mrs. Swink. Wada, answered Willa Jean. Mrs. Kemp smiled as if Willa Jean had said something clever and explained, She named the bear Roger after the milkman. Mrs. Quimby said with amusement, I remember when Ramona named one of her dolls Chevrolet after the car. Everyone laughed. She didn't have to go and tell that, thought Ramona, feeling that her mother had betrayed her by telling, as if it were funny, something that she had done a long time ago. She still thought Chevrolet was a beautiful name, even though she was now old enough to know that dolls were not usually named after cars. "See my bear?" Willa Jean held Roger up for Ramona to admire. Because everyone was watching, Ramona said politely, "He's a nice bear." And he was a nice bear, the nicest bear Ramona had ever seen. He was big and soft with a kindly look on his furry face, and this was the best part. Each of his 4 big paws had 5 furry toes. You could count them, 5 on each paw. Even though Ramona felt that she should be outgrowing bears, she longed to hold that bear, to put her arms around him and hug him close and love him. "Would you like me to hold your bear for you?" she asked. "No," said Willa Jean. "Ramona," whispered Mrs. Quimby, "take Willa Jean into the kitchen and sit her at the table so she won't spill orange juice on the carpet." Ramona gave her mother a balky look, which was returned with her mother's "you do it or you'll catch it" look. Mrs. Quimby was not at her best when about to serve a meal to a living room full of guests. In the kitchen, Willa Jean set Roger carefully on the chair before she climbed up beside him, displaying her ruffled underpannies, and grasped her orange juice with both hands, dribbling some down the front of her fresh pink dress. Mrs. Quimby, assisted by Beezus, set out a platter of scrambled eggs and another bacon and sausage beside the gelatin salad. Hastily, she snatched 2 small plates from the cupboard and dished out 2 servings of brunch, which she set in front of Ramona and Willa Jean. Beezus, acting like a grown-up, filled a basket with muffins and carried it into the dining room. Guests took plates from the stack at the end of the table and began to serve themselves. Ramona scowled. If Beezus got to eat in the living room with the grown-ups, why couldn't she? She was no baby. She would not spill. "Be a good girl," whispered Mrs. Quimby, who had forgotten the marmalade. "I'm trying," thought Ramona, but her mother was too flurried to notice her efforts. Willa Jean took 1 bite of scrambled eggs and then went to work, patting the rest flat on her plate with the back of her spoon. Ramona watched her charge give her egg a final pat with the back of her spoon, pick up her bear, and trot off to the living room, leaving Ramona alone to nibble a muffin, think, and look at her artwork, arithmetic papers, and some cartoons that her father had drawn, which had been taped to the refrigerator door for the family to admire. Nobody missed Ramona. All alone out there in the kitchen, conversation from the living room was boring, all about high prices and who would be the next president, with no mention of children or anything interesting until someone said, "Oops, careful, Willa Jean." Then Mrs. Kemp said, No, Willa Jean, mustn't put your fingers in Mr. Grumpy's marmalade. It's sticky." Mrs. Quimby slipped into the kitchen to see if the coffee was ready. "Ramona, it's time to take Willa Jean to your room and give her your present," she whispered. "I changed my mind," said Ramona. Mr. Quimby, refilling the muffin basket, overheard. "Do as your mother says," he ordered in a whisper, "so that kid will give us a little peace." Ramona considered. Should she make a fuss? What would a fuss accomplish? On the other hand, if she gave Willa Jean her present, maybe she would have a chance to hold that lovable bear for a little while. "Okay," Ramona agreed without any enthusiasm. Mrs. Quimby followed Ramona into the living room. "Willa Jean," she said, "Ramona has a present for you in her room." Willa Jean's attention was caught. "Go with Ramona," Mrs. Quimby said firmly. Willa Jean, still clutching her bear, went. "Here," Ramona thrust the package at Willa Jean, and when her guest set her bear on the bed, Ramona started to pick him up. Willa Jean dropped the package. "Roger's my bear," she said, and ran off to the living room with him. In a moment, she returned bearless to pull and yank and tear the wrapping of the package. "That's not a present." Willa Jean looked cross. "That's Kleenex." "But it's your very own," said Ramona. Sit down and I'll show you what to do. She broke the perforation on the top of the box and pulled out one pink sheet and then another. See, you can sit here and pull out all you want because it's your very own. You can pull out the whole box if you want. She did not bother telling Willa Jean that she had always wanted to pull out a whole box of Kleenex, one sheet after another. Willa Jean looked interested. Slowly she pulled out one sheet, then a second, and another, and another. She began to pull faster. And soon she was pulling out sheet after sheet and having such a good time that Ramona wanted to join the fun. "It's mine," said Willa Jean when Ramona reached for a tissue. Willa Jean got her feet and pulled and flinging ran down the hall to the living room. Ramona followed. "See me," Willa Jean ordered the grown-ups as she began pulling and flinging Kleenex all over the room. Guests grabbed their coffee mugs and held them high for safety. "No, no, Willa Jean," said Mrs. Kemp. "Mrs. Quimby won't like you wasting her Kleenex." "It's mine!" Willa Jean was carried away with the joy of wasting Kleenex and being the center of attention at the same time. "Ramona gave it to me." Ramona looked around for the bear, which was sitting on Mr. Grumpy's lap. "Would you like me to hold Roger?" Ramona asked. Careful not to say Roger. No, the bear's owner saw through Ramona's scheme. "Roger wants to sit there." Mr. Grumpy did not look particularly pleased. Willa Jean's parents made no effort to stop their daughter's spree of pull and fling. Ramona watched, feeling much older than she had earlier in the day. She also felt awkward while Beezus moved around the living room, dodging Willa Jean and pouring coffee as if she were a grown-up herself. At first, guests were amused by Willa Jean, but amusement faded as coffee mugs had to be rescued every time that Willa Jean passed by. Pink Kleenex littered the room. Ramona heard Mr. Huggins whisper, "How much Kleenex is in a box, anyway?" Mrs. McCarthy answered, 250 sheets. "That's a lot of Kleenex," said Mr. Huggins. When Willa Jean came to the last piece of Kleenex, she climbed to the couch and carefully laid it on Mr. Grumpy's bald head. "Now you have a hat," she said. Conversation died, and the party died too. No one called Willa Jean an angel now, or blessed her heart. The Grumpys were first to leave. Mr. Grumpy handed the bear to Willa Jean's mother as Willa Jean filled her arms with pink tissues and tossed them into the air. "Whee!" she cried and scooped up another armful. "Whee!" Their departure seemed to be a signal for everyone to leave. "Don't you want to take the Kleenex with you?" Mrs. Quimby asked Willa Jean's mother. "We can put it in a bag." "That's all right. Willa Jean has had her fun." Mrs. Kemp was helping Willa Jean into her coat. "Bye-bye," said Willa Jean prettily as her father carried her and Roger out the door. Other guests were telling Mr. and Mrs. Quimby how much they had enjoyed the brunch. Beezus was standing beside them as if it had been her party too. Mrs. McCarthy smiled. "I can see that you are your mother's girl," she said. "I couldn't get along without her," Mrs. Quimby replied generously. "Goodbye, Juanita," said little Mrs. Swink. "Goodbye, Mrs. Swink," answered Ramona, polite to the end. She tossed an armful of Kleenex into the air so that her mother might notice her too. Somehow, tossing someone else's pulled-out Kleenex was not much fun, and Mrs. Quimby was so busy saying goodbye to the other guests that she did not pay any attention. At last the door was closed, and from the porch where the neighbors were opening umbrellas, Ramona's sharp ears caught her name. "Willa Jean certainly reminds me of Ramona when she was Willa Jean's age," someone said, and someone else answered, "She's Ramona all over again, all right." Ramona was filled with indignation. "Willa Jean is not me all over again," she thought fiercely. "I was never such a pest." "Whew," said Mr. Quimby. "That's over. What's the matter with those people letting that kid show off like that?" "Too much grandmother, I suppose," answered Mrs. Quimby. "Or maybe it's easier for them to ignore her behavior. Come on, let's all pitch in and clean up this place. And Mr. Quimby, Ramona, you find a bag and pick up all the Kleenex." "Kleenex is made of trees," said Beezus, already helping her mother collect coffee mugs from the living room. "We shouldn't waste it." Lately, Beezus had become a friend of trees. "Put the bag of Kleenex in the cupboard in the bathroom," said Mrs. Quimby, "and let's all remember to use it." I never was as awful as Willa Jean, Ramona told herself as she went to work collecting 250 pieces of scattered pink clinics. I know I wasn't. She followed the trail of clinics back into her bedroom, and when the 250th piece was stuffed into the bag, she leaned against her dresser to study herself in the mirror. How come nobody ever calls me my mother's girl? Ramona thought. How come mother never says she couldn't get along without me? Do you think Ramona's having some issues, some feelings of inadequacy maybe? Maybe she doesn't feel like her mother loves her as much as she loves her older sister, Jesus. But you know that's not true. All right, so let's look at, this is a picture of Ramona. Remember, Ramona's 7.5 years old. And here is a picture of Ramona saying hi to Willa Jean and the nice, beautiful, big, squishy bear that Ramona longed to hold. Never got a chance, did she? And that is a picture of the Kleenex being pulled out by Willa Jean and thrown all over the living room while the adults sat and tried to have their conversation. And nobody even stopped Willa Jean from pulling out all of that stuff. That is the end of chapter 1. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.